Class, we're going to be looking at Bible history, archaeology, and geography, and titling it Where the Faithful Walked, because you can still go to those places today, which is what this is based on the places that you can still see where you can look and say, so-and-so walked right here. There are places where within just a few feet, we know where Jesus stood. A few feet, we know where Paul would have walked and different things like that. And so there's lots and lots and lots of ways that we can look at that. And I want to do that by looking also at what the Scripture has to say. So I'm going to hopefully bring the Bible alive by showing you some of these things that helps us understand why the Bible says the things that it does. For example, in Psalm 137, verses 5 through 6, he says, "If I forget you," the psalmist does, "O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. If I do not remember you, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy." Now, why would a psalmist write something about a city called Jerusalem? Why is he so adamant about this feeling that he has for this city? Well, quite frankly, it's because the city of Jerusalem itself is the world's most influential and historical city that there has ever been. When you stop and think about it, all the history and all the focus that has happened of all the cities in the world that still exist, that's the thing, where you can go and see, of all the cities that exist, there's none that stands above Jerusalem. And that's because not only is it an impeccable city in history, but also because of the central focus, that center of worship. It is now the center, one of the centers of worship for Islam. It is still the center of worship for Judaism. And of course, Christians will go there as well because they know that's where the church began, in Jerusalem. It is the most significant city in the world. So I want to begin by looking at Jerusalem and some things about that city and make the Bible make some applications for you in regards to history as well as archaeology and so forth. Because Jerusalem is a highly prized city. It is one, as you know just from history, that began with the Jews, but then was conquered by the Babylonians. It was then rebuilt by the Jews. It was then conquered by the Romans. And then it was rebuilt by the Ottomans. And then now Islam and Judaism are just sharing that city, if you will. But the Muslims are the ones who are in control of where the temple would have stood. And so what happens over all that time is that Jerusalem that you see today is not the same Jerusalem that Jesus would have seen, at least not 100%. Here's Jerusalem today. So today you can go there, and this is a view from back on the Mount of Olives, looking back at the Temple Mount and the Dome of the Rock there, that Islamic Dome of the Rock. And you can see the city stretching off, the more modern city of Jerusalem stretching in the distance. And you see those old walls there in the front. Here's an aerial view of what Jerusalem would look like today. And I want you to notice all the hills and the mountains and everything else. But down in the lower right-hand corner there, so if you look in this area right here, there's that Temple Mount. And I want you to notice those old walls right here that go around the city of Jerusalem. This is the old ancient city of Jerusalem. This is the new city. So in Jesus' time, here's what might be an aerial picture. They didn't have planes back in Jesus' time. But if you could take an aerial photograph, notice that you still see the same mountains and hills. There's the valley, Kidron Valley. Here is the Valley of Hinnom. And so you have all these mountains, everything around. It's just you don't have all the buildings that we have today. So let's go back to Jesus' time. Let's go back to Jerusalem and let's look at this city. And primarily I want to focus on one aspect of this city. And that is the first thing that we might wonder about, is that in the Bible, for example, there are multiple verses, but one of them is Mark chapter 15, verse 41, that says, there were also these women who ministered and followed Jesus, and when he was in Galilee, and many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. Now, if you read the context, they are in Galilee. So it'd be like us being, for example, up in, let's say, in Montgomery or something. It's really not even that far. Galilee is a lot closer to Jerusalem than you realize. But let's just, for the sake of us driving and so forth, we're in Montgomery, and we say we're going to go up to Milton. Well, that sounds kind of confusing to us, doesn't it? Because we don't go up when we think we're going south. We would say we're going down to Milton. We're going to go up to Montgomery. So how is it that they're saying up? Well, it's because of the fact that whenever you see this cross section, if you look at all those mountains that I was showing you, those hills that I showed you in the picture just a minute ago, Jerusalem is up. It's kind of like Denver. All right, it's not 5,000 feet. Denver is a mile high, but it's like Denver. We know Denver is up in the mountains. Well, Jerusalem is up in the mountains. And so that's why, for example, whenever he was telling the parable of the Good Samaritan, it says, then Jesus answered and said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves. And that's because when you zoom in, if you could cut Israel in half like this. So you've got there on the right side, there's the Mediterranean Sea, and on the left side, you keep going going east so that you come to the Dead Sea. This is what you would see if you could cut it in half. Notice the Dead Sea is down below sea level. That was a very strange feeling, by the way, when Andrea and I visited the Dead Sea, is that we realized we're actually below all oceans and everything else. It's kind of an unsettling feeling. But I want you to notice where Jerusalem is. Jerusalem is up on this mountain. So whenever he says he goes down to Jericho, he's not kidding. So here is Jerusalem, 2,500 feet, and Jericho is minus 825 feet. That's a pretty significant hill. Now, if you turn this map north and south, so now we're at this direction. We're looking over at the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and to our right up here is what would be Mount Hermon. This is also where you would have there we go. Here's the Sea of Galilee. All right, so here's where Jesus is from, and going down that valley into the Dead Sea. And notice you're going down, but look what is up. Here's Mount Zion. There's Mount of Olives up from Galilee. So no matter which direction you go, whether you're coming from the east and going west, you're going to go up from Jericho. If you're from Galilee, you're going to go up from Galilee to Jerusalem. And so that's why they mean going up. Here's another view. And so now you have, if you're looking to the north, there's the Mediterranean Sea here on the left. Here's the Sea of Galilee. And so Jesus would have walked down this way, or one time he went through Samaria. But either way, he's coming up, or if you're down in Jericho, you're certainly going up. And if you want to see what that looks like, there it is. This is called the Wadi Kelt. A wadi is simply like a runoff. Really, Jerusalem is actually back up this direction over here, but for the sake of seeing the up and down, you can see that you have to travel up. Now, here's why all this is important. If you, again, turn around and you're looking this time, we're down in the valley. There is the Dead Sea over here, and this is what would be modern Jericho, and here is ancient Jericho, the Tel, where those walls fell in that they marched around. And I want you to notice, you go this way, and there's that Wadi Kelt, and you go up, 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 and way up, really up over here is Jerusalem. And here's why this is important. The Psalms. There's a section in the Psalms that are called the Psalms of Ascent. What's ascent? It's going up. And the Psalms were sung by the various Jewish pilgrims who had to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year to present themselves for example, the Passover, the booths, and the first fruits when they would go up and worship. And they would sing these psalms like Psalm 122 verse 4, where the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, to the testimony of Israel, to give thanks to the name of the Lord. And many of those psalms mention going up to the temple, up to Jerusalem. Another one, 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 28, one of the saddest chapters in all of the Bible, whenever Israel is split into 2 different nations. You have the northern nation that takes on the name Israel, and then the southern nation, which is 2 tribes, 10 to the north, 2 to the south, and they're called Judah. And the culprit behind that was Jeroboam. And Jeroboam figured out if people go down to Jerusalem, or go up to Jerusalem, I should say, then they're going to go back to God. I don't want them to go back to God. I want them to be loyal to me. So he said, therefore the king, he asked advice and made 2 calves of gold. He said to the people, it's too much for you to what? Go up to Jerusalem. Now he's in the north. Remember what I showed you with Galilee and everything? So it's still going up. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you out of the land of Egypt, which is obviously false, as he set that golden calf up in Bethel. And then, of course, with what the Bible says, then he took the 12 aside, Jesus did, and said to them, behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and all things that are written by the prophets concerning the Son of Man will be accomplished. This was his last journey when he is making his way, and he is going up to Jerusalem. So every time you see that phrase, up to Jerusalem, I hope now that you can have in your mind where the faithful walked, and you'll think of, oh yeah, like the Good Samaritan. He would have, that's why he was robbed, because the robbers were hiding, and you saw those little clefts and everything. They had places to hide. And so now you can have a picture in your mind of where they walked. Another thing that I want to highlight about where they walked in Jerusalem is the walls. You remember when Jesus said this in Luke 19 verse 40, whenever they were crying out, and some of the Pharisees and stuff was basically saying, you need to tell these people to calm down. They were crying out Hosanna and everything else, and he answered and said, I tell you that if these should keep silent, the stones, talking about the walls, when he was ascending up into Jerusalem, the stones would immediately cry out. Why did Jesus say that? What's significant about those walls of Jerusalem? Well, I want to share with you the history of those walls. And here's a picture of Andrea and myself when we were in Jerusalem. And we're there at that, what's known as the Western Wall. At one time it was called the Wailing Wall. This is where the Jews go. It is the most holy place in Judaism. And it's not really a wall, actually. What it actually is, it's a retainer. It's a retaining wall. It's not a wall like the fortified walls that go around Jerusalem. It's a retaining wall of which the temple sat. So it was built out, and I'll explain more of that. But here's why I say the history is important. Because when looking at that Wailing Wall, the Western Wall where the Jews go, there's history right there. There are 4 different sections of history. On the very bottom, the first 7 rows of stones that you see right there, those are the original stones that were put there by King Herod. You remember in the Bible whenever they came up to Jesus and he said, what do you mean you're going to tear this place down and everything? It took 40 years to build this. They're talking about King Herod. And whenever the Romans came in and destroyed it, remember what Jesus said? Not one stone will remain upon the other. So they took it all the way down to that. So then after that, there was Islamic people that came in, the Umayyad period. That was around 600s. That's whenever Muhammad came about. And they wound up rebuilding some of this section right here. So there are 4 courses of stones that they put back up there to build this back up. And then up to from several years afterwards and up to about 1866, you had the Ottomans, which we'll talk more about in just a minute. The Turkish Empire, the Ottomans that came in, also Islamic, and they built more. They put more stones up there. So there's 14 courses of stones that they did. And then even after that, as early as 1967, you have the Sunni Muslims that are adding more stones on top of this retaining wall that is so holy to the Jews. Now here's an interesting thing about that retaining wall, is that with all of Jerusalem, I told you that the Jerusalem you see today is not the Jerusalem that Jesus would have seen, only parts and pieces of it. That's because even the actual walls that go around Israel, Jerusalem, and we'll talk more about these in just a second, they're made up of different people. Notice that this one picture right here, you have this right down here, this wall right down here was built during the Hasmonean period. That's that 400 years of silence. Then you have over here, this is the original Herodian wall that's all in crumbles right here. And behind us, this nice looking wall, that was built, remember when I was telling you about the Ottomans in the 600s, that was built 600 AD. That's actually not true. That the Ottomans would be after that. So within the last couple of hundred years. Same way here. Here's a medieval time. During the Crusades, they built a tower right here. And that's what's left of it. But back behind here are those walls that were built just a couple of hundred years ago. This is also a wall that's been uncovered whenever Hezekiah, he expanded the city. And we now have gone down and can see those walls. So what in the world is going on with all these walls? How do we know anything about what Jerusalem was like and everything? And you're going to see the significance of why Jesus said, oh, if the stones could cry out. So here's what we see of that western wall, that picture I showed you just a minute ago. It's just a little small section of that overall platform that it sits on. And I want you to notice that that little gray section is all that you see when you saw that picture of me and Andrew just a minute ago, where all those Jews go and they pray. That's all they're seeing. That red line, that's ground level. So notice there's a whole bunch still down below that red line, right? That wall goes on down. So this is what happens all throughout Israel, and that's what the word tel means. Whenever somebody would come in and destroy the towns, they would just pile everything up, and then they would just build on top of the pile. And they just kept doing that. They'd destroy it, and they'd build on the next pile, and they'd build on the next pile. And you have this big hill after so many thousands of years. Well, that's what's happening in Jerusalem. All that stuff piled up. Whenever the Romans came in, all those stones that they had knocked down, they just smoothed it over and started building again, and that's continued. So what winds up happening is this little section right down here, that little yellow circle, you can go down there. And we did. And so we took a tour down in there, and you can see some of these massive stones that King Herod brought and pulled out. Remember what I said? It took 40 years to build this. That's what the Jews were saying. By the way, that's Richard McCool right there. And the technology. And if you remember what the Bible says, that whenever they were building the temple in Solomon's time, they quarried all of the stones in the quarry, and everything took place out there so that there were no hammer sounds when they were building the temple. So a lot of history that is there in those walls. All right. Going back, let me go back to this. If you go down, so this is the western wall where all those Jews were. If you go down this way, notice there's that red line again. All that was covered up. Notice how deep it is over here because this valley goes down. If you go down to that corner, this is what you see. As you now see, they've uncovered this. This is where the ground level was. That's where the ground level is for the western wall, which is over there. But on this side, they've uncovered it, and they've gone all the way back down to the base. This was the original base right here of what would have been this picture right there. So that original base, notice right down there it is. See it? Right down there's that original base where people would have walked, where Perhaps Jesus and the apostles and others would have walked right here on this. And there are a bunch of those stones that were pushed off of the top up here. And some of those stones have all kinds of carvings on them. For example, one of those stones is a stone that has on there the writings that no Gentile shall pass beyond this point, the penalty of death. You remember Paul talking about the middle wall of partition, saying that that Gentiles are not supposed to go beyond that section to go into the temple. Well, that stone was found there in that rubble pile. And so that's what we see here in this picture. Okay, so the walls themselves, that was just what's known as the western wall, that retaining wall really. But let's look at the actual walls. I mentioned to you the walls that you can go there today and see, which is pretty impressive, and they're old. They've been there a long time, built during the Ottoman period and actually built during the early 1500s, middle 1500s by an Ottoman sultan named Suleiman the Magnificent. He came, was in charge of the entire region, and he's the one who built the walls in which we see today. So the question is, okay, that's interesting and neat. So is that what it looked like in Jesus' time? Is that what Jesus would have seen? Maybe it's not the exact same walls that were there because those were all destroyed. But are these the walls that Jesus saw? Well, let's take a look at that and I'll show you how all this works. So here's the modern walls today. This is modern Jerusalem today. These red line right here, there's the Temple Mount. Here's the western wall right here. There's the Dome of the Rock. And you'll notice that Jerusalem is divided into 4 different quarters now. So now you have the Muslim quarter, the Christian quarter, the Armenian quarter, and the Jewish quarter. And each one's a little bit different. And in another lesson, I'm going to show you the streets of Jerusalem and all the various things that are there. It's incredible. This old ancient city, that many of the walkways and stuff are still there that perhaps Jesus and Paul and all the others would have walked on. But these walls that are there in that red outline, I'm going to use that red outline to show you how Jerusalem came about. Jerusalem began very small. It was just one little section right here. So imagine those red lines that are up here, that none of that was there. Only thing that was there was this little section right here was called the Jebus, the city of David, which we're going to explain a little bit more in just a second. But I just want you to see the walls for right now. That's all that was there. So focus on that little section. It's green. All right, that's where Jerusalem started. And like I said, the modern walls, that's what we have today. So already we see there's a difference in what was Jerusalem, and especially when we come to Jesus' time, how much things would have changed. Because you remember who took Jebus? It was David, right? And then what did David want to do? What did David want to do for God? He wanted to build a temple. But what did God say to David? No, not you, but your son. And so his son indeed built walls. Now, these are the walls that Solomon built. We have found many of those walls. Still not the same walls as these. Notice this is still further out. So those modern walls don't even line up with Solomon's walls. So Solomon expands the city and builds that temple, and everything then goes fine and grows. But then what happened? The Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians primarily came and destroyed Jerusalem. And then who came back and rebuilt Jerusalem? Nehemiah. So this would be the time of what Nehemiah found. So there's that green again. There's the city of David, which is the original Jerusalem. Then he wound up building out very similar to what Solomon did. He just kind of added a little bit extra here. And this part out here, he still hasn't rebuilt yet. So here you can see the progress. Then by the time we get to Jesus, we now have some of what is there today. This is where Herod did. So he took what was a smaller Temple Mount and made it much larger, made it huge. So now this wall does line up with what would be the original wall. And in the time of Jesus, this would have still been included. So the walls came all the way down here and around, all the way out to here. There are some other walls that are in between here that are all part of growth. It's kind of like what's happening in Milton and Pace right now, right? We all, for a lot of us that have lived here a long time, we know about how big Milton was and Pace was. Well, now how big is it? Keeps getting bigger, right? Well, that's what happened. Well, what happens? We drive by and we go, well, I remember this was as far as the road went. You know, you got Miss Josie probably knows about stuff like that, right? You know, the road only went this far. Well, that's what those walls right there represent inside, and even this one that lines up here. So there are sections that do still line up with the original walls. Remember, the red is what we see today. So even with that, we're not seeing it all. So here's an artist's depiction of how that would have looked, and to bring the Bible alive in some of this regarding of the walls. I want you to be thinking about what Jesus said. If the stones could cry out, it starts back with the city of Jebus. In Joshua chapter 18, verse 28, it lists off these cities that were in Canaan, and one of them was Jebus. In Judges 19, verse 10, you have this story of this priest or this man who was going by, and he was talking about maybe going over and staying in Jebus. When you get to 2 Samuel chapter 5, you have an extremely interesting story of David and his men who decided they wanted to take Jebus to be his own city. Does anybody know how David was able to take the city of Jebus, that fortified city? He climbed up through the water shaft. See, down in the lower right here, there's a well that's down here, and they cover that well over, but in order to get to the water, there has to be this shaft to get down to it. And you have to let the water out. The spring is a natural spring, and David climbed up through that shaft and came on the inside of Jebus and conquered the city for himself. Another part you might remember too is that whenever David wanted to build the temple, he wound up buying Araunah's threshing floor, which is up here, and you can read about that in 2 Samuel 24, verse 18. That is Mount Moriah. This is the mountain where it is believed that Abraham took Isaac to go and sacrifice. This mountain has seen many things, and here it is that Solomon then, taking that little city that he inherited from his father, he then expands it backwards. So you see there, you see how you got the front part is the original Jerusalem, Jebus, the city of Jebus, now the city of David. He expands it out, and Solomon builds walls and temples and palaces into all this area. And you can read about that whenever in 1 Kings chapter 8, really, whenever he gives that prayer of dedication. But from 1 Kings chapter 3 to chapter 6, you can see all of the building that he did, getting the various lumber and various materials from around the region and from even from other kings. And then look at that city, and you'll see that that's then whenever it grows to even bigger time. So you can see that little spur. That's what I want you to keep your eyes on, that little spur. It's called the Spur of Ophel. Ophel is this little hill right here. So it's called the Spur of Ophel, the city of David, Jebus. And that little spur right there is now encompassed. They bring the walls further out. And then they go further out this way over to, this is Mount Zion, by the way. And that's where the city grew out to. And by the time you get to King Hezekiah, he has built the walls out more. Other kings did as well. You'll notice that inside the city there are other walls that have been built. It doesn't even go out as far as it will in Jesus' time, which goes way back here. And then also you have Hezekiah, who took that Gihon spring, dug a tunnel down through the rock in order to bring the water to right here so that all the city inhabitants could get to this water. That is the pool of Siloam. Remember hearing about that or reading about that in the Bible? And so over and over we see how this beautiful city has grown. Now we come to the time whenever it was destroyed. So now all those walls have been torn down out here from Nebuchadnezzar coming in. That's where you have 2 Kings right here. Whenever Nebuchadnezzar comes in, destroys this city, Nehemiah then, years later, is given permission to go back and rebuild the walls. And so what does he do? There's that spur of Ophel, the old city. He rebuilds those walls around here. All these walls out here have been torn down. And gets all this done so that they have basically kind of back to the time of Solomon. And then in the next several hundred years is whenever Herod comes in. And Herod then expands. There it is. You can see how much bigger it is. Let me back up here for you. So there it is. It's rather small. It doesn't come out to the full edge of the hill. And Herod expands it way out here. There's still the spur of Ophel, but notice it's now fully encompassed in what is now a much larger city. Even more expansion going out here. There's a wall here, and more expansion here, more expansion going out here. This is during the time of Jesus. This is when Jesus would have come into Jerusalem. I tell you that if these keep quiet, the walls would cry out. The stones would cry out. Look what you just learned. Just in that little bit of history, Jesus is saying there is so much that has happened in this city. And that's not even including all of the prophets that have been murdered, not including all of the other things that have happened, the horrible things that happened whenever the city was sieged by Nebuchadnezzar and Sennacherib. And so over and over we see history coming alive. And so now this is what we would have seen with a view, an artistic view of what Jesus would have seen coming into the city of Jerusalem. And there it is. There's that the spur of Ophel, the city of David right here, the original Jebus. Here's the Gihon Spring will be over here. There's the pool of Siloam. And then this is the old city, and back over here is Herod's palace. Here is the Fortress Antonia, and there are bridges that go across here, and we believe that Jesus was brought right in here in this area where he was put on trial at Caiaphas' home. You can go there today and see those, and I'll, in another lesson, show you some of those. But that's the walls, and now we come to the modern walls of Jerusalem. But I hope now that means a lot more to you whenever he says these stones would cry out. And there's been a lot more happen since then because the Romans came and destroyed those walls, and now we have a whole different set of walls that when we see today, not exactly the same, but some of it is, like for example this one. This is on the other side of the Temple Mount. So on the other side, on that other side is the western wall. This is the eastern wall. This is the wall that you see looking at the Temple Mount. There's the top of the Dome of the Rock. And I want you to notice that whenever we read in Luke chapter 7, he came near the gate of the city. Behold, a dead man was being carried out, and the only son of the mother, and she was a widow, and a large crowd from the city was with her. Jesus went in and out of the gates of the city of Jerusalem. And this gate right here is a very special gate. This is one of the main entrances into the city of Jerusalem that took you directly into the Temple Mount. It's called the Golden Gate. And I want you to notice that it's been closed in. But what's interesting, that's not the full gate. Because if we look at that gate, here's a picture of the group that was in Jerusalem, and here is that gate off in the distance. I was just telling you, this is the eastern wall. There's the Dome of the Rock. Here's the southern steps, which we're going to talk about in just a moment with more gates. But here's that Golden Gate looking across the Kidron Valley. This is a view from Gethsemane and the Garden of Gethsemane, and there it is, the Golden Gate. But that gate right there is what it looks like today Here's what it looked like in Jesus' time. Remember what I showed you earlier about how there's the ground level? Well, now you have the ground level, which is what you see, but there's a lot more of the gate down below, and there's been a lot of archaeological work done that is the actual gate that Jesus would have gone through. Now, why would they cover all this up? Why would they cover all this in? Well, it's because there are many that believe in the prophecies that are in Scripture that Jesus, the Messiah, is going to come and he's going to enter through the eastern gate. So one of the Islamic sultans said, you know what? We're going to stop this right in its tracks. We're going to block this whole gate up. And it's been blocked ever since. But there are still those who say, it's okay. God is God. He can open that gate right back up. And so they put a bunch of graves and everything in front of it because, a Jew's not going to walk by a dead body. Isn't that crazy? But here's the interesting thing. Is Jesus going to go through that gate? No. So there are those of premillennialism who still think he's going to go through that gate. Here is the dung gate. Andrea and I went in and out of the dung gate a few times that's real near right going into the western wall. Here is I believe this is the Lion Gate, or it is the Damascus Gate. It's very pretty. There's several gates around the city that you still go through to get through. But here's one, to close out, here's one last gate I want you to see. On the southern steps, there's another gate. It's called the Triple Gate. And there's actually two gates on that southern side. There's the Triple Gate and the Double Gate. And these, again, were gates that went up into the temple. And here's the part that just took my breath away, is that you're going up and you can see these triple gates. These are gates that would have been there during the time of Jesus. But of course the Muslims don't want you just going into the Temple Mount, so they blocked them all up. But there's one interesting thing. There is a piece of stone that is right at the entrance of the Triple Gate that is from the first century. That stone right there is a stone that Jesus Christ would have stepped on. Because there are many different things in Scripture that talks about when he entered in the temple that he would have, because of where he would have gone through the double or the triple gate. And if not Jesus hadn't gone through there and part of his life, we know that Peter did, because Peter was preaching on the southern steps, or other apostles. But there's a stone that you can see, that you can go to today and walk